What happens when a CEO goes undercover at his own fast food chain and witnesses something he was never supposed to see? One late-night pizza order, a crying delivery driver, and a truth so shocking, it changes everything. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, coating the streets of Chicago in a slick, glistening sheen. Inside the Prime Slice Pizza on West Monroe Street, the air was thick with the aroma of melted cheese and garlic. But there was no warmth to be found. The kitchen was a war zone, pans clattered, oven doors slammed, and the staff darted between stations with the urgency of soldiers under fire. Ethan Caldwell sat in a dimly lit corner booth, a paper napkin folded neatly under his fingertips. The noise around him was relentless, orders being shouted, the relentless ring of the service phone, the grumbling of impatient customers. He had been in plenty of restaurants like this before. But tonight, he wasn't here as the CEO of Prime Slice. He was just another customer, here to see his business from the ground level. The front door swung open with a gust of cold air, and Miguel Rojas stepped inside, his shoulders hunched, his breath visible in the fluorescent glow. His jacket was soaked through, rainwater dripping from the ends of his sleeves. He moved sluggishly, like a man carrying a weight too heavy for his frame. In one hand, he clutched the insulated delivery bag, the Prime Slice logo smeared from the rain. He had barely set the bag down when Derek Thompson descended on him like a hawk. "You think this is acceptable?" Derek's voice cut through the chaos, silencing the room. He was a tall man with a permanent scowl, his polo shirt stretched tight over his stomach. He snatched the bag off the counter and yanked it open. "This is cold. I got a call from a customer saying their pizza showed up late and half warm. What the hell do I even pay you for?" "Huh?" Miguel lifted his hands in protest, his voice calm but exhausted. "The roads are flooded, Derek. I had to wait at 2 intersections because I don't want to hear it." Derek snapped. "You think the customers care about your excuses? I don't care if it's raining, snowing, or if God himself is blocking traffic. Your job is to deliver a hot pizza. If you can't handle it, you can get the hell out and find something else to do." A few employees stole nervous glances at Miguel but quickly turned away, busying themselves with their tasks. No one wanted to be caught in Derek's crosshairs. Miguel clenched his jaw and looked down, nodding slightly, the fight draining from his eyes. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation, and Derek knew it. Ethan remained motionless, his expression unreadable. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, his mind absorbing every detail, the way Miguel's hands trembled, the way Derek's voice carried through the restaurant like a judge delivering a sentence. This was his company, his employees, and yet, he had never seen this side of it before. He exhaled slowly, the heat from his coffee barely masking the cold fury rising inside him. Miguel pushed through the doors of Prime Slice Pizza without a word. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but his shoulders were still stiff with frustration as he pulled his hood over his head. He didn't rush to his motorbike, he just stood there for a moment, breathing, staring at the wet pavement like he was trying to ground himself. Then, with a sigh, he swung a leg over the seat, started the engine, and sped off into the night. Inside, Ethan sat motionless, his untouched pizza cooling in front of him. He should have eaten. That's what he came here for, wasn't it? A routine check-in. But after what he'd just witnessed, the food on his plate felt meaningless. The sharp sting of Derek's voice still echoed in his ears, the weight of Miguel's silence heavier than the rain outside. He slid out of the booth, leaving a generous tip, and walked out into the night. The city hummed around him, car horns, the soft chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren. As he made his way to his car, he realized his hands were clenched at his sides. The plan had been simple. Come in, observe, leave, no interference, no assumptions. But now, something gnawed at him, something that wouldn't let go. A few blocks away from the restaurant, he slowed at a red light. That's when he saw him. Miguel, standing at the side of the road, his motorbike stalled, the kickstand barely holding it upright. He was talking to someone on the phone, shaking his head. Then, as if accepting defeat, he yanked off his helmet, grabbed the pizza bag from the back, and took off on foot. Ethan watched as the young man darted between cars, sprinting across the street, clutching the bag like it was his last chance at keeping his job. His shoes splashed through puddles. His jacket clung to his back. And yet he didn't slow down. Something pulled in Ethan's chest. It was too familiar. He had been Miguel once. Years ago. He had been the one running deliveries. Scraping by. Taking whatever shifts he could to cover rent and tuition. He knew that exhaustion. He knew that fight. The light turned green. But he didn't move. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching Miguel disappear into the night. When Ethan got home, he didn't go to bed. Instead, he went straight to his office, turned on his laptop, and logged into the company's internal system. The screen glowed in the dark, illuminating the deep lines on his face as he began pulling reports. Customer complaints, employee turnover, payroll discrepancies. The numbers weren't adding up. The further he dug, the worse it got. Complaints from delivery drivers about missing wages. Reports of being forced to work overtime without pay. Claims that had been quietly dismissed or labeled as misunderstandings. Some of them had names attached: Miguel Rojas, Javier Morales, Anthony Lee. Others were anonymous. But the pattern was there. Then he pulled Derek Thompson's record. A dozen formal complaints from employees. All swept under the rug. Multiple reports of verbal abuse, unfair termination, and manipulated timesheets. And yet, every annual review praised him for cost efficiency and team discipline. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about a bad manager. This wasn't about one bad night. This was systemic, and if no one else was going to fix it, he would. Ethan had spent the better part of the night sifting through reports, piecing together a picture that only got uglier the deeper he looked. By morning, his mind was set. This wasn't just a problem with one bad manager. It was systemic, and if it was happening in one store, there was no telling how far it spread. But he wasn't going to storm in and start making demands. If there was one thing he had learned in all his years running a business, it was that people covered their tracks when they sensed trouble. He needed proof, something undeniable. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he landed on a familiar name. Sophie, he said when she picked up. I need you to pull some reports for me. Sophie Lang had been with Prime Slice for years. Long enough to know that when Ethan called her directly, it wasn't for small talk. As the company's director of human resources, she had access to employment records, turnover rates, and internal complaints, the kind of data that didn't lie. By noon, she was in his office with a folder in hand. The numbers don't make sense, she said, dropping into the chair across from him. That store has the highest turnover rate in the district. But on paper, there's no record of any issues. No terminations. No official complaints. Nothing. Just a revolving door of employees. Ethan flipped through the documents, scanning the neatly typed lines. People coming and going every few months. Some lasting only weeks. And yet, the records painted a picture of smooth operations. They're either quitting, Sophie continued, or they're being pushed out. Either way, it's being buried. Ethan nodded slowly. It was confirmation of what he already suspected. Now, he needed more. That afternoon, he made another call, this time to someone who no longer worked for Prime Slice. Carlos Ramirez picked up on the third ring. You got the wrong number. The voice on the other end said, clipped and wary. Carlos, it's Ethan Caldwell. There was a beat of silence. The CEO? That's right. Carlos let out a dry laugh. Never thought I'd get a call from you. I need to ask you a few questions about your time at the Monroe Street store. Ethan said, off the record. Carlos hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Derek, what can you tell me? For the next 20 minutes, Ethan listened as Carlos laid it all out. The unpaid overtime, the threats, the way Derek manipulated timesheets, trimming hours, docking paychecks over minor complaints. We all knew if we said anything, we'd be gone, Carlos said. Didn't matter if you'd been there 6 months or 6 years, if you made too much noise. He found a way to get rid of you. One guy tried to report him once. And the next week, his shifts were cut to 2 hours a day. He had no choice but to quit. Ethan felt his grip tighten on the phone. Why didn't you say anything when you left? Carlos let out a bitter chuckle. Who was gonna listen? HR? They work for you. I figured it was just how things worked in this company. That last sentence stung more than it should have. Ethan thanked him and ended the call, his mind already moving to the next step. He needed more than just testimony. He needed something tangible. That's when he thought of Owen Parker. Owen had been with Prime Slice for 5 years, working in quality control. His job was to make sure company policies were followed at every level, from food safety to customer service. If there was anyone who could walk into that store unnoticed and get a closer look, it was him. The next morning, Ethan called him in. "I need you to go to the Monroe Street location," he said. "As a customer, see how things run, how the employees are treated. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just observe." Owen arched a brow. "You think something's off?" "I know something's off." Owen didn't ask questions. He just nodded and left. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her end of the investigation. When she compared payroll records to actual logged hours, the discrepancies were glaring. Drivers were clocking in for 12-hour shifts but only getting paid for 8. Some names disappeared from the system entirely after a few weeks, as if they had never worked there at all. That night, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Owen. "I got something," he said. "I recorded it. I'll send it over now." A few seconds later, an audio file appeared in Ethan's inbox. He pressed play. Derek's voice came through, sharp and unmistakable. "I don't care if you're tired. I don't care if you just got here. If I tell you to stay, you stay. You want to keep your job? Then you shut up and do what you're told. Otherwise, don't bother showing up tomorrow." Ethan sat back, jaw tight. This was the proof he needed. And it was only the beginning. Derek Thompson had always prided himself on keeping his store under control. He ran a tight operation. And as far as he was concerned, that was the only way to get results. Employees were replaceable, rules were flexible, and numbers, well, numbers could be adjusted. But lately, something felt off. It started with whispers, conversations that stopped the second he walked into the room, employees stiffening when he passed by, their glances a little too cautious. The delivery drivers weren't complaining out loud, but they weren't as quick to take extra shifts either. They were hesitating. Derek noticed Miguel, one of his more reliable drivers, had stopped nodding along whenever he demanded extra hours. Other drivers, too, seemed reluctant to accept the usual unspoken rules, working off the clock, absorbing the blame for delayed deliveries, keeping their mouths shut. Then there was that guy, the one who came in a few nights ago. Derek had barely looked at him at the time, just another customer sitting quietly in the corner. But now, after hearing the rumors, he wondered, had that been someone from corporate? The thought made his stomach tighten. He wasn't about to let some uptight executive or disgruntled employees ruin what he had built. That evening, he locked the doors early and called a mandatory staff meeting. The employees, cashiers, cooks, drivers, stood in a loose, uncomfortable circle around him. The usual background noise of the restaurant was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Derek let his eyes sweep over them before he spoke. "I don't know what kind of crap you all have been saying," he said, his voice sharp. "But let me make one thing clear. Whatever happens in this store stays in this store." A few employees exchanged glances but said nothing. "I don't want to hear about anyone running to HR or talking to people they shouldn't be talking to." He crossed his arms. "If I find out that someone here is trying to stir up trouble, you won't have to worry about your next paycheck, because you won't be getting one." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. A few employees nodded, others simply stared at the floor. Satisfied, Derek turned his attention to the computer in his office. He wasn't stupid. If someone was poking around, he needed to make sure there was nothing for them to find. He pulled up payroll records, adjusting time entries, ensuring that overtime hours didn't appear anywhere they shouldn't. Complaints that had made it into the system were reassigned as resolved. His numbers were clean now. By the time he finished, his nerves had settled, at least, until his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and hesitated. Then, slowly, he picked up. "It's handled," he said, keeping his voice steady. On the other end, a voice responded. "It better be." Derek exhaled through his nose, gripping the phone tighter. "There's nothing to find. I cleaned it up." "You better hope so. If this turns into a problem, you'll be the one taking the fall." The line went dead. He set his phone down and ran a hand through his hair. If corporate was looking into his store, it wasn't just bad luck. Someone had put them onto him. And he intended to find out who. What he didn't know was that he wasn't the only one listening to that call. Emily Tran had been counting the register in the back when Derek's voice carried through the thin office door. At first, she wasn't paying attention. Then she heard something that made her stop. "There's nothing to find. I cleaned it up." She knew she shouldn't, but instinct took over. She reached for her phone, hit record, and held it near the office door. She only got a few seconds of audio before Derek hung up. But it was enough. Emily stared down at her phone, her heart pounding. She had two choices: pretend she hadn't heard anything, or do something about it. She thought about Miguel, about how exhausted he looked when he came in from deliveries, about the drivers who had quit without a word, their names never mentioned again. Before she could second-guess herself, she sent the recording to Owen Parker. The response was immediate. "Got it. Stay quiet. We'll take it from here." That same night, Ethan and Sophie listened to the recording in Ethan's office. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but the meaning was clear. Derek wasn't just covering his tracks, he was answering to someone else. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "This isn't just one bad manager," Sophie murmured. "Someone higher up is protecting him." Ethan nodded. "And we need to find out who." Ethan sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen reflecting off his glasses. The numbers on the payroll spreadsheets stared back at him, riddled with inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored. Sophie sat across from him, her arms crossed, her expression tight with frustration. "The math doesn't add up," she said, scrolling through the data. "We have payroll records showing a certain amount of wages being paid out. But the money that's actually being withdrawn from company accounts is higher, way higher." Ethan leaned forward, rubbing his temple. "How much are we talking?" Sophie clicked a few keys, then turned the screen toward him. "Over the past year, roughly $200,000 in extra withdrawals. But those funds don't show up anywhere on the official payroll." Ethan exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about a store manager cutting corners, this was something bigger. Someone was pocketing money under the guise of labor costs, siphoning it through the system without a trace. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Owen Parker. "Got another recording from Emily. Sending now." Ethan clicked the attachment, and Derek Thompson's voice filled the room. "They're asking too many questions. Mike, I did what I could to clean things up. But I need to know, are we covered?" A pause. Then a deeper voice responded. Steady and controlled. "Relax. Just make sure there's nothing for them to find. If corporate sends someone, we'll make sure they only see what they need to." Ethan looked up at Sophie. "That's Michael Green." Michael Green, regional manager for Prime Slice, oversaw multiple locations across the Midwest. He wasn't just a middleman, he was the kind of executive who made sure things ran smoothly. For better or worse. Sophie frowned. If he's involved, that explains the missing money. If Derek was faking payroll numbers to cut costs, Michael had to be the one approving them. Ethan tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking. Derek squeezes the employees, forces them to work unpaid hours, and submits payroll reports that look clean. Michael signs off on them, keeping corporate happy with low labor costs. And in return, he gets a fat bonus for running efficient stores. Sophie let out a dry laugh. "And I bet Derek gets a cut for playing along." It was a perfect scam, on paper. Michael was a top-performing regional manager. His locations consistently reported lower labor costs than other regions, making him look like a financial genius. Meanwhile, the employees doing the real work were being exploited. And it had been happening for years. Derek, now fully aware that someone was digging, was growing paranoid. He tightened control over the store, watching employees more closely, snapping at even the smallest mistakes. The tension was building. And then, just like clockwork, Derek made his first move. Javier Morales, one of the longest-serving drivers, was fired. The news hit Miguel hard. Javier had been at Prime Slice longer than almost anyone, a quiet but respected figure among the staff. He wasn't the type to cause trouble, but he had always been the one to subtly push back against Derek's worst demands. Miguel stormed into the back room where Emily was on break, his fists clenched. "Javier's gone. No warning. Nothing." Derek just pulled him aside. handed him his last check, and told him he wasn't needed anymore. Emily's face went pale. This is because of everything going on, isn't it? Miguel nodded. He's making an example out of him, letting us all know what happens if we don't fall in line. Emily swallowed hard. We have to tell Owen. If Ethan knows how far this is going. Yeah, Miguel said, pulling out his phone. Meanwhile, in his office, Ethan stared at his inbox. A new email had arrived, with no sender name. Subject: You're looking in the wrong place. He opened it. I worked for Prime Slice for 4 years. Thought the same thing you did, that it was just a bad manager here or there. But it's bigger than that. The system is built this way. What's happening in Chicago is happening everywhere. You want the truth? Start looking at the other stores. You'll see. Ethan's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about Derek Thompson. This wasn't just about Michael Green. This was about Prime Slice itself. The boardroom at Prime Slice headquarters was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline. The sleek oak table stretching across the room like a battleground. Ethan sat at the head, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Around him, the board members murmured among themselves, shifting in their seats as the last few executives filed in. Then the door opened, and Michael Green stepped inside. Ethan watched as the regional manager took his seat with practiced ease, flashing the room a confident smile. Michael had been in the business long enough to know that posture was everything. Act like you belong, and most people will believe you do. Ethan, however, wasn't most people. Once the room settled, Ethan cleared his throat. Let's get started. A projector whirred to life, casting spreadsheets onto the far wall. These are the payroll records for our Chicago stores. Ethan began, his voice calm, steady. At first glance, everything looks normal, but when you compare these numbers with actual employee work logs, a different picture emerges. He clicked to the next slide. Side-by-side columns showed stark discrepancies, hours worked versus hours paid. It was undeniable. We have reports of drivers being forced to work off the clock, payroll numbers being manipulated, employees being denied wages they've earned. A murmur rippled through the boardroom. Michael leaned back, arms crossed. With all due respect, Ethan, we oversee hundreds of locations. If there were a few reporting errors, that hardly qualifies as a systemic issue. Ethan didn't react. Instead, he pressed play on the audio recording. Derek's voice filled the room, sharp and irrefutable. I don't care if you're tired. I don't care if you just got here. If I tell you to stay, you stay. You want to keep your job? Then you shut up and do what you're told. Silence. Michael's jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. That's one manager, one store. Are we really going to blow this out of proportion? Ethan turned to him. It's not just one store. With a click, he pulled up a new slide, financial reports from multiple locations. The same pattern, inflated efficiency numbers, missing wages, eerily identical payroll discrepancies. This is a coordinated effort to cut labor costs. The only question is, who else knew about it? Michael's confident mask wavered. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, leaned forward. Michael, you oversee these stores. Are you saying you had no knowledge of this? Michael forced a chuckle. Of course not. And if there were errors, I would have addressed them. But let's be honest, this sounds like an overzealous manager padding his numbers. If anything, Derek Thompson is the problem, not me. Ethan expected that. He turned to Sophie, who handed him another file. Derek might be a problem. Ethan agreed, but he's not acting alone. He laid the new documents flat on the table. These are Derek's financial records. Specifically, the deposits made into his personal accounts over the last year. Notice anything unusual? A few of the board members leaned in, scanning the pages. Regular deposits. Ethan continued. Every quarter, thousands of dollars beyond his salary. He turned to Michael. And all from shell companies linked to, guess who? Your personal investment firm. Michael paled. The room fell into stunned silence. One of the older board members cleared his throat. Michael, this is serious. Michael straightened. I don't appreciate being ambushed like this. You can't just throw accusations around. We can. And we will. Ethan cut in. And unless you have a very good explanation for why store managers under your supervision are getting secret payments from your accounts, I suggest you start cooperating. The air in the room had shifted. A few board members who had seemed hesitant before now exchanged glances. One of them finally spoke. I motioned to suspend Michael Green from his position pending further investigation. Michael's face hardened, but he said nothing. Ethan leaned back, letting the weight of the moment settle. The battle wasn't over, but this was a victory. As the meeting ended and the board members trickled out, Ethan remained seated, his mind already on the next step. Then his phone buzzed. A message. No caller ID. Stop now, or there will be consequences. Ethan stared at the screen. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The anonymous text still sat on his phone. The words glaring at him like a warning carved in stone. Stop now, or there will be consequences. He'd received plenty of threats in his career, but this one felt different. It wasn't an empty attempt at intimidation. It was a promise. By morning, he had instructed Sophie to tighten access to company records and had Lucas, his IT security specialist, scan for any signs of internal breaches. If Michael, or anyone else, tried to cover their tracks, Ethan wanted to know before it happened. Still, he knew this wasn't the end of it. Michael wasn't the type to sit back and wait to be taken down. He was going to fight. And he didn't have to wait long to see how. The first blow came before noon. A news article started making the rounds in the corporate sector, first in obscure business blogs, then in larger outlets. The headline was vague but damning. Internal power struggles shake Prime Slice Pizza's leadership. The piece painted Ethan as a CEO desperate for control, using an exaggerated investigation to weed out his rivals. It framed Michael as a respected executive, blindsided by a politically motivated attack from his own boss. The article cited anonymous company insiders, claiming that Ethan had a habit of micromanaging and had been looking for an excuse to push out longtime executives. Sophie burst into Ethan's office, her phone still in her hand. Have you seen this? Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. Michael's playing dirty. This is bad, Sophie said, pacing. The board is already split on you after that meeting. This kind of thing is going to make them nervous. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. We need to hit back before this narrative sticks. But before he could even start formulating a response, the second attack landed. That afternoon, Derek Thompson resurfaced. Word spread through the Chicago store that Emily Tran had been suspended. The official reasoning? Alleged misconduct, specifically, fabricating evidence against management for personal gain. Derek had spun a story about how Emily had been desperate for a promotion, implying that she had tampered with recordings and misled corporate in order to boost her standing. The result? Employees were terrified. Miguel called Ethan directly. No one wants to talk anymore, he said, frustration lacing his voice. Everyone saw what happened to Emily. They think if they say anything, they'll be next. Ethan gritted his teeth. He had known Derek was going to retaliate. But this was calculated. Targeting Emily wasn't just about silencing her, it was about sending a message. And it was working. By the time Ethan got back to his office, another problem was waiting for him. His legal counsel, Linda Grayson, was seated across from his desk, arms crossed. She slid a printed email toward him. We have a problem. Ethan scanned the document. Michael Green had officially filed a complaint with the board, alleging that Ethan's investigation was a conflict of interest. He claimed that Ethan was interfering in internal operations without proper oversight, accusing him of launching a personal vendetta against his leadership team. If the board sided with Michael, they could force Ethan to step away from the investigation entirely. Ethan set the paper down, exhaling through his nose. He's trying to cut me off at the knees. Linda nodded. And if he succeeds, you won't just lose control of the investigation. You'll lose credibility with the board. They'll start questioning whether you should even be CEO. Ethan looked out the window, his mind racing. Michael had turned the fight into a war, and Ethan was running out of time to win it. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the email from legal. The weight of Michael's attack was pressing down harder than he had anticipated. The board was hesitant, the employees were scared, and the media was already shaping a narrative that painted him as the villain. Then his phone rang. A blocked number. He hesitated for only a second before answering. A familiar voice came through, low and cautious. Ethan Caldwell? Speaking. This is Javier Morales. Ethan straightened in his chair. Javier had been one of the longest-serving delivery drivers before his sudden termination. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the day Derek fired him. I don't have a lot of time. Javier continued, but I have something you need to hear. Ethan kept his voice calm. Go ahead. Javier exhaled, then lowered his voice. Before they let me go, I was asked to drop off a package at the district office. I wasn't supposed to see anything, but I caught a glimpse of the screen while Derek was showing Michael something. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. They were emails, Javier said. Michael was giving Derek instructions, telling him how to adjust payroll, how to cover up overtime hours, even how to phrase termination reports so corporate wouldn't ask questions. Do you have copies? Ethan asked. Javier hesitated. No, they wiped them from the system. But I remember one thing. Derek mentioned a name. Someone Michael was reporting to. A pause. Ethan could hear the tension in Javier's breath. He said, we don't move unless Holloway gives the green light. Richard Holloway. Ethan's stomach turned. Holloway wasn't just some middle manager. He was a senior executive, a board member, and one of the company's most influential figures. If he was involved, that meant this went all the way to the top. Ethan took a steady breath. Javier, I need more than a name. Are you willing to help me get proof? Javier hesitated. I lost my job because of this. I can't afford to lose anything else. Then let's make sure what you lost wasn't for nothing. There was silence. Then, finally, Javier spoke. What do you need me to do? Ethan's next call was to Lucas Meyer. Lucas had worked in Prime Slice's IT department for years, managing data security and compliance. He was brilliant, but he kept his head down, avoiding corporate politics at all costs. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. I need access to deleted emails. There was a long pause before Lucas replied. That's not how it works. Ethan, you're telling me there's no way? I'm telling you corporate servers don't keep backups of deleted files past 30 days. Even if I could access them, digging into executive records without authorization is a fireable offense. Ethan leaned back. I'm asking you to help me fix a system that's broken. That's a nice sentiment, Lucas said, but if I get caught, I won't just lose my job, I'll be blacklisted from every major IT firm. Ethan could hear the hesitation in his voice. Lucas wanted to help, but fear was holding him back. So he played his final card. If you don't help, people like Michael and Derek win. And they'll keep winning because no one is willing to take a risk to stop them. Then, finally, I'll need a few hours. Lucas worked through the night. By morning, Ethan had a message waiting for him. Meet me in the basement garage. When Ethan arrived, Lucas was already there, sitting in the driver's seat of his car, laptop balanced on his knees. The glow of the screen illuminated his face. Tense but determined. I found something, Lucas said, turning the screen toward Ethan. A series of recovered files filled the display. Emails, not just between Michael and Derek, but between Michael and Richard Holloway. Ethan scanned the text. Holloway's instructions were clear. Keep labor costs down, no exceptions. Adjust payroll as needed to meet quarterly targets. Ensure delivery performance metrics remain optimal, regardless of actual conditions. And then, at the bottom of one email, if Caldwell starts asking questions, let me know. Ethan felt a chill. They had been watching him long before he even knew what was happening. Before Ethan could say a word, Lucas cursed under his breath. The system just locked me out. Ethan tensed. What do you mean? I mean someone just triggered a security override. The whole server just went into lockdown mode. Lucas tried typing, but the access request was denied. Every folder, every email, gone in real time. Someone knew what they were doing, and they were erasing everything. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed Sophie. Sophie, we have a problem. Her voice was tense. I know. Corporate just sent out a company-wide memo. IT is running a full security audit. Anything suspicious is being flagged and purged. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't just damage control. It was a cover-up. They had only minutes before everything disappeared for good. Lucas met Ethan's eyes. Whatever we do, we need to do it now. Ethan paced his office, gripping his phone as he listened to Sophie on the other end. They locked down the system, she said, her voice hushed. It's running a full audit. They're deleting everything flagged as suspicious. Ethan exhaled, trying to steady his thoughts. How much time do we have? Not much, Sophie admitted. Once corporate IT wipes something, it's gone for good. Ethan knew this was coming. Michael had been preparing for this fight longer than he had. But there had to be a way around it. Tell me we still have access to something. He pressed. Sophie hesitated. There's a backup server, she finally said. Corporate's disaster recovery system. It's off-site, used for emergency restores. Think cyber attacks. Hardware failures. They don't wipe that system because it's separate from the main network. Ethan's pulse quickened. Can we get to it? Sophie sighed. Technically, yes, but only senior executives have access. You'd need credentials with admin clearance. Ethan sat down, his mind working through the problem. Who has that kind of clearance? Me, Sophie said, and the IT department. He didn't hesitate. Then let's make this happen. Hours later, the office was dark except for the soft glow of Lucas Meyer's laptop. They had waited until well past midnight, long after most employees had gone home. Lucas sat hunched over his keyboard, fingers flying across the keys. His monitor flickered as he navigated into the off-site backup system. Sophie stood nearby, arms crossed, keeping an eye on the door. Almost there, Lucas muttered. Just need to bypass the security checkpoint. Ethan watched the screen as folders began populating. Go straight for the executive emails, he instructed. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then Lucas let out a sharp breath. Got it. Ethan leaned in. The emails were all there. Records of Michael instructing Derek to manipulate payroll. Notes on how to doctor financial reports. Proof that this wasn't just negligence, it was a coordinated effort to defraud both employees and the company itself. Then Lucas hesitated. Hold on. What? Sophie asked. Lucas scrolled further, his expression tightening. There's a flagged transaction log. Looks like large payments were being funneled through a private account. Ethan studied the numbers. The amounts were significant, six-figure transfers moving every quarter. This isn't just payroll fraud, Ethan murmured. Michael's been skimming off the top. Then the office lights flickered. A second later, the entire room went dark. An alarm blared through the building. Shit, Lucas muttered. They tripped the system. Sophie darted to the window. Outside, headlights flashed as a security vehicle pulled into the lot. Ethan clenched his jaw. How long until they get up here? Minutes, if that. Lucas slammed his laptop shut and yanked the power cord free. We have to move. But it was too late. The door swung open, and 3 security guards stepped inside. Behind them, calm and composed, was Michael Green. He took his time stepping into the room, hands in his pockets. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, I assume you have a good reason for being here at this hour? Neither Ethan nor Lucas spoke. Michael's eyes flicked to the still glowing monitor. He let out a slow chuckle. Breaking into company servers? That's a bold move, Ethan. Ethan folded his arms. You mean retrieving information you illegally deleted? Michael ignored him, turning to the guards. Escort them out, he ordered. Then, as if just remembering, he added, actually, let's make this official. I'm pressing charges for unauthorized access and data manipulation. Sophie took a step forward. You don't have the authority to. Michael smirked. I don't need it. I just need enough cause to get the board involved. Ethan clenched his jaw as the guards closed in. Michael leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You should have walked away, Caldwell. By morning, the entire board of directors had been called into an emergency meeting. Michael stood confidently before them, a carefully crafted narrative at his fingertips. Ethan has overstepped, he told the board, voice full of forced disappointment. He's turned a routine business audit into a personal crusade, hacking into internal systems under the guise of an investigation. Several board members exchanged wary glances. Michael sighed. I don't want to escalate this further, but I have no choice. For the good of this company, I recommend that Ethan Caldwell be placed on indefinite leave while we conduct a formal review of his actions. Silence filled the room. Ethan sat back in his chair, watching the faces around the table. Some were skeptical, others, especially those who had worked closely with Michael, looked all too eager to take the bait. Ethan knew this was his last chance to flip the script. If he didn't, Michael would win. Ethan stood at the head of the long, polished conference table, his hands steady but his mind racing. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension, a quiet hum of unease settling over the gathered executives. Across from him, Michael Green sat with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. This was it, the moment that would determine whether Ethan's fight for the truth would succeed, or if Michael would walk away. Untouchable. Sophie and Owen Parker entered first, each carrying thick folders. They placed them on the table, their presence a silent message. Ethan wasn't alone in this. Then came the witnesses. Miguel Rojas stepped forward, his stance firm despite the nerves in his eyes. Emily Tran followed, her jaw set in quiet determination. Finally, Javier Morales entered the room, his gaze locking onto Michael for just a second before he took his seat. Ethan met Michael's eyes. "We're here to establish the truth," he said, "not speculation, not spin, just the facts." Michael gave an exaggerated sigh. "This is ridiculous. I assume you brought us here for something more than employee grievances?" Ethan ignored him and turned to Miguel. "Tell them what you told me." Miguel cleared his throat. "Derek Thompson made us work extra hours off the clock. If we refused, he cut our hours or threatened to fire us." Emily followed. "When I recorded him admitting to this, I was suspended. They tried to paint me as a liar." Javier leaned forward. "I was fired because I knew too much. And I know for a fact Michael Green ordered the payroll numbers to be manipulated." Michael scoffed. "Accusations from disgruntled employees mean nothing." Ethan gave a slight nod to Lucas, who was watching from the back of the room. Lucas tapped his laptop, and the projector screen flickered to life. The emails appeared. A quiet murmur rippled through the boardroom as the executives scanned the damning messages. Every instruction, every alteration, every cover-up was laid bare. Michael's face paled, but he quickly forced a smirk. "This proves nothing," he said, voice clipped. "Derek handled payroll. If anything, he acted alone." Ethan didn't blink. "Then how do you explain this?" Lucas pressed another key. A video appeared in the inboxes of every board member. The room went still as the audio played. Michael's voice came through, clear as day. "I don't care how you do it. Pay them off. Fire them. Make them disappear. I'm not losing my damn bonus over a few drivers complaining." Then, slowly, all eyes turned to Michael. His jaw tightened. "Where did you get that?" Ethan leaned forward. "Doesn't matter. What matters is that this company has a choice: stand for integrity or protect corruption." Michael shot to his feet. "This is a setup, a goddamn witch hunt. You think you can do this to me?" The board chair calmly set his pen down. "We've heard enough." A vote was called. Unanimous. Michael Green was terminated effective immediately. Derek Thompson was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Ethan exhaled slowly, victory settling over him like a weight lifting off his shoulders. But as he left the boardroom, something was waiting for him. A single envelope on his desk. Inside was a piece of paper. Its message simple: "You think you've won? This system has more than just Michael. Keep digging, and be ready for the consequences." Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Ethan sat in his office, the weight of the anonymous note still fresh in his mind. The words lingered like a shadow, a reminder that his fight was far from over. He had won the battle against Michael Green and Derek Thompson. But the war? That was just beginning. His initial plan had been simple: clean up the mess, restructure company policies, and ensure fair treatment for employees. But if this system ran deeper, if Michael had only been a pawn in something larger, then fixing policies wouldn't be enough. Someone else was pulling the strings. Ethan exhaled and reached for his phone. "Lucas," he said the moment the IT specialist picked up, "I need you to dig deeper." Lucas sighed on the other end. "I had a feeling you'd say that. Find out where those hidden transactions lead. If there's another name behind this, I want to know." It took less than 24 hours for Lucas to call him back. "You were right," Lucas said, voice tight. "Michael wasn't working alone. I found something bigger." Ethan leaned forward in his chair. "Go on." Lucas hesitated, then sent over a file. Ethan clicked it open and scanned the contents. A series of wire transfers, large sums of money moving between anonymous accounts before being funneled into a private investment fund. The name attached to that fund? Ethan's stomach dropped. Richard wasn't just another executive. He was a cornerstone of Prime Slice Pizza, a senior board member, and once the company's chief financial officer. He had been around long before Ethan ever stepped in as CEO. And now, it seemed, he had been orchestrating something much bigger than what Michael had been caught doing. Ethan rubbed his temple. How deep does this go? Lucas hesitated. Deep enough that I almost stopped digging. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Lucas sighed. I found references to financial dealings that don't just stop at payroll fraud. Some of these accounts are connected to shell corporations, companies with no real employees. No real offices. Money moves in, then disappears. Whatever Richard is doing, it's not just about squeezing workers for unpaid hours. This is bigger. Ethan felt the familiar weight of realization settle in. Michael had been a distraction. The real danger had been standing in the boardroom with him all along. The next morning, Sophie walked into his office and closed the door behind her. You need to stop, she said quietly. Ethan looked up from his screen. What? Sophie's expression was unreadable. There's talk going around. Richard knows. Ethan's hands tightened on his desk. And? Sophie exhaled. And if you don't back off, you're going to regret it. Ethan studied her carefully. Is that a warning or a threat? She met his gaze. Neither. Just a fact. Sophie, I can't just walk away from this. She sat down, shaking her head. I've been in this company long enough to know how things work. Richard Holloway isn't Michael Green. Michael was careless. Richard isn't. Ethan frowned. What are you saying? Sophie leaned in slightly. I'm saying that every time someone tried to take him down before, they lost. Their reputations were destroyed. Some lost their jobs. Others, she trailed off. Ethan could hear the hesitation in her voice. Others what? She looked away. I don't know. They just disappeared, moved away, changed industries. But one thing's for sure, none of them ever worked in corporate again. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind turning over the implications. Richard Holloway wasn't just a corrupt executive. He was someone who had spent years fortifying his position, making himself untouchable. But no one was untouchable forever. That night, as Ethan drove home, he noticed it. A black SUV. 2 cars behind him. He switched lanes. So did they. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He wasn't paranoid. Someone was following him. When he reached his street, he slowed, watching the SUV carefully. It didn't follow him directly but parked a few houses down. Engine running. A blocked number. He answered. A deep voice. Smooth and calm. You handled Michael well, but if you keep pushing, you won't get another chance to fix your mistakes. Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was personal. Ethan stood in front of the large conference table, his fingers tapping against the surface as his team settled into their seats. The room was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the bright skyline outside the window. The stakes had changed. This wasn't just about cleaning up a broken system anymore, it was about survival. Lucas Meyer sat with his laptop open, his face tense. Sophie Lang, arms crossed, looked more exhausted than ever. Owen Parker leaned forward, listening intently. Miguel Rojas, the only non-executive among them, shifted in his seat, looking both determined and uneasy. Ethan exhaled slowly. Michael Green was a symptom. He said, Richard Holloway is the disease. Silence followed. They all knew it was true. Holloway wasn't just another corrupt executive. He was the architect of everything, the missing money, the labor violations, the shell corporations, and worse, he had the power and influence to make problems disappear. If we don't stop him, Ethan continued, nothing changes. We need to hit him where it hurts. Lucas rubbed his temples. We have the financial records tying him to the offshore accounts. But it's not enough. He'll claim plausible deniability. Owen nodded. Unless we get something irrefutable, he'll bury this. Miguel glanced between them. Then we need to take this outside the company. Ethan had already been thinking the same thing. If Holloway controlled the company from the inside, the only way to beat him was to take the fight outside. The next morning, Ethan stepped into his office only to find Sophie waiting for him, her phone in hand. You need to see this, she said, handing it over. A news article was plastered across the screen, its headline bold and damning. Prime Slice CEO under fire for internal power grab. The article painted Ethan as an egotistical executive trying to eliminate his rivals, portraying Michael Green as a victim and questioning whether Ethan had fabricated the allegations against him. Ethan clenched his jaw. Holloway. Sophie nodded grimly. He's using the media to turn the board and investors against you. We've already had calls from major shareholders. Some are asking if you should step down. This was Holloway's opening move. He wasn't confronting Ethan directly. He was manipulating perception, eroding his credibility until the board had no choice but to force him out. Ethan set the phone down. Then we move now. That afternoon, he placed a call to Angela Monroe, one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. Angela had made a career out of exposing corporate corruption. If she took this story, Holloway wouldn't be able to spin his way out of it. An hour later, she called back. I've been hearing things about Prime Slice. She said, I assume you have something worth my time? I have more than something. Ethan replied, I have the truth. They met at a quiet cafe on the north side of Chicago. Ethan arrived first, scanning the street before stepping inside. Angela was already seated, her notepad ready. Tell me everything, she said, getting straight to the point. Ethan laid it all out, the payroll fraud, the financial manipulations, the anonymous offshore accounts. He gave her the names, Michael Green, Derek Thompson, and finally, Richard Holloway. Angela listened carefully, only stopping to jot down notes. And you have proof? Ethan nodded. I have the records. She leaned back, exhaling. This is big. If I publish this, Holloway will be finished. Ethan's gaze hardened. That's the idea. Angela closed her notebook. All right, I'll start putting this together. But you should know, if Holloway really is as powerful as you say, he won't go down without a fight. Ethan had no illusions about that. Neither will I. That night, Angela called him. They know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stiffened. What do you mean? I'm being followed. Ethan turned toward his office window, scanning the dark streets below. Are you safe? I'm leaving town for a while, she said. This story is too big to kill. But I need to be careful. A pause. Then, in a quieter voice, be careful too. Ethan, these people don't play fair. Then the line went dead. When Ethan returned to the office, something felt off. The hallway was empty, the usual late-night workers gone. He reached his door and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. Frowning, he knocked. No answer. Security, he called. Minutes later, a guard arrived and forced the door open. Inside, Ethan froze. The office had been cleaned out. His desk was empty. The files, gone. The laptop, missing. On the desk, a single sheet of paper remained. The message was simple. You think you can win? Ethan clenched his fists. Holloway had just declared war. Ethan stood in the middle of his ransacked office, his fists clenched at his sides. The room had been stripped clean. Every document, every file, every shred of evidence he had gathered, gone. The screen of his desktop monitor was black, the system completely wiped. His filing cabinets were left open, their contents missing. Even his personal notebooks had vanished. Whoever had done this hadn't just been thorough. They had wanted to send a message. Richard Holloway had erased everything. Lucas Meyer sat on the edge of the desk, his face pale. It's all gone, he muttered, shaking his head. All of it. Sophie Lang paced near the window, arms crossed. This was a professional job, not some random break-in. Owen Parker exhaled sharply. So, what now? Without evidence, we've got nothing. Miguel Rojas, standing near the door, cleared his throat. Maybe not. All eyes turned to him. Miguel hesitated, then said, I think I know where we can find something. 15 minutes later, the team gathered in a back office at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. Miguel placed his phone on the table and pulled up a photo. I took this 2 years ago, he said, tilting the screen toward Ethan. It was a delivery slip, an address in the outskirts of Chicago. I was supposed to take a package from one of the district offices and drop it at this location. Didn't think much of it at the time, but something about it felt off. So I took a picture of the label. Sophie frowned. You think it's important? Miguel nodded. I remember asking Derek about it once. He told me to forget I ever saw it. Lucas leaned in. If they had us deliver things outside of company locations, it means they were hiding something. Ethan stared at the address. It was a lead, the only one they had left. We go there, Ethan said, his voice firm. Sophie gave him a sharp look. And if it's a trap? Then we'll find out soon enough. The warehouse stood at the edge of an industrial zone. Its metal siding rusted with time. A chain-link fence surrounded the property. But the gate was unlocked. Ethan and Lucas slipped inside, moving carefully through the darkened structure. The air smelled of dust and stale paper. Stacks of old filing cabinets lined the walls. Some open, some locked. Lucas moved to a nearby computer, booting it up. If they stored anything digital here, I'll find it. Ethan grabbed a thick folder off a nearby table. Inside, he found ledger books, pages upon pages of altered financial records. Payroll fraud, shell corporations, offshore accounts, everything. This is it, Ethan muttered. This is what we need. Lucas turned from the computer. I'm pulling up encrypted emails. They tie directly to Holloway. Then, a noise. The sound of footsteps. Ethan's stomach dropped. He turned just as the warehouse lights snapped on. A dozen men in dark suits stood by the entrance. And at the center of them, smiling, was Richard Holloway. Richard approached, his expression one of amusement. Well, he said, clasping his hands together. I was wondering when you'd find this place. Ethan didn't move. Richard gestured at the papers in Ethan's hand. Go ahead, take a good look. You like chasing ghosts, don't you? Ethan's grip tightened on the folder. You covered your tracks, but not well enough. Richard chuckled. Ethan, you're a smart man. You had to know this was coming. He stepped forward. I let you find this place. Richard continued. I knew the moment Michael fell, you'd keep digging, so I made sure you'd end up here. Ethan's stomach twisted. A trap. Lucas stiffened. Then why let us in? Richard smirked. Because I'm offering you a choice. He pulled a document from his pocket and placed it on a nearby crate. Ethan stepped forward and scanned the page. A resignation letter. His name was already typed in. You walk away, Richard said smoothly. Resign. Leave quietly, and I'll let you go. Ethan didn't answer. Richard's tone darkened. Or you can refuse, and I promise you, within 24 hours, your entire career will be over. Ethan felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Resign, and he walked away with nothing. Fight back, and risk losing everything. Richard leaned in, voice almost a whisper. You have no evidence, Ethan, no case, no friends left in high places. Then he smiled. So tell me, what's your move? Ethan stared at Richard Holloway, then at the neatly printed resignation letter sitting on the crate between them. The ultimatum was clear. Walk away quietly, or be destroyed. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The low hum of the warehouse's flickering overhead lights buzzed in the background. Then, Ethan chuckled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't nervous. It was the laugh of a man who had just seen his opponent blink first. Richard's smirk faltered. Something funny? Ethan leaned forward, voice cold. If you need to silence me, that means you're scared. Richard's jaw clenched. You should have taken the easy way out. He snapped his fingers. The two security guards flanking him moved forward. Lucas tensed beside Ethan, whispering, now would be a good time. Without breaking eye contact with Richard, Lucas tapped a hidden command on his smartwatch. Across the city, in a quiet apartment, Sophie Lang's computer flashed awake. A data transfer bar appeared. Transmitting files. Ethan had planned for this. While Holloway had been busy setting his trap, Lucas had been working behind the scenes. The moment they entered the warehouse, Lucas had activated a remote connection to his encrypted server. Now, every financial record, every manipulated payroll report, every deleted email implicating Richard was being sent to the press, law enforcement, and federal investigators. All they had to do now was survive long enough for it to reach them. The first guard lunged at Ethan. Years in the corporate world had sharpened Ethan's mind, but not his fists. He barely ducked in time, the punch missing his jaw by inches. Lucas wasn't a fighter either, but he had something better, a can of industrial-strength pepper spray. With one quick motion, he sprayed the second guard directly in the face. The man stumbled back, gasping. Ethan seized the opportunity. He slammed his shoulder into the first guard, knocking him into a stack of crates. Before the second could recover, he grabbed Lucas's arm. "Run!" They sprinted toward the exit, ignoring the furious shouts behind them. Richard's voice bellowed through the warehouse. "Stop them!" They burst through the side door and into the cold Chicago night. By the time Ethan and Lucas reached safety, the damage had already been done. The files had gone public, and the world was watching. The collapse of Richard Holloway. The fallout was immediate. News outlets ran headlines that shattered Holloway's carefully constructed empire. Every major publication covered the scandal, complete with financial documents, whistleblower statements, and insider testimony. By noon, Prime Slice Pizza's stock had plummeted. By evening, the company had issued an emergency statement announcing a full internal investigation. And by morning, the board of directors had called a meeting. Richard Holloway stormed into the conference room, demanding control, but the board members were already one step ahead. One by one, they spoke. "This company can't survive with you here. You've turned Prime Slice into a liability. This is bigger than you, Richard." The final blow came when a representative from the Department of Justice walked through the doors. Accompanied by federal investigators, they handed Richard a warrant for financial fraud, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. For the first time in his career, Richard Holloway had no power left to wield. 2 officers escorted him from the building. The arrest of Derek Thompson. As the media focused on Holloway's downfall, law enforcement continued digging. It didn't take long for them to find evidence linking Derek Thompson to wage theft, coercion, and falsified records. 3 days later, he was arrested at his home in the suburbs, still in his pajamas, with reporters waiting outside. It was over. Ethan's victory. Weeks passed. The company changed. Policies were rewritten. Employees were given back pay for stolen wages. Ethan stood before the press, announcing a complete overhaul of corporate ethics. Miguel Rojas returned to work, this time with fair conditions. Lucas Meyer was promoted, his efforts in exposing the corruption recognized. Sophie Lang was named Chief Operating Officer, ensuring that no one like Richard Holloway could ever rise again. It was a win, a real one. But then came the letter. Ethan arrived at his office one morning, expecting another routine day. Instead, he found a single envelope sitting on his desk. Inside, there was only a single note. "You won this battle, but the war isn't over." Ethan stared at the words, feeling the weight behind them. He had taken down Holloway, but had he truly destroyed the system that had created him? Somewhere, in another boardroom, someone was watching, waiting, planning. Ethan set the note down and smiled. He wasn't done yet. Ethan Caldwell stood at the front of the Prime Slice Pizza headquarters, looking out over the packed conference room. Rows of employees, from executives to delivery drivers, filled every seat. Some faces were familiar: Sophie Lang, Lucas Meyer, Owen Parker, Miguel Rojas, while others were new. This wasn't the same company it had been 6 months ago. The air was different, lighter. For the first time in years, people weren't just working to keep their heads down. They were working towards something better. Ethan adjusted the microphone and took a breath. "We made a promise," he said, his voice steady. "A promise to fix what was broken, to rebuild trust, and to make sure that no one is ever exploited in this company again." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. "We are implementing real changes," Ethan continued, "not just empty policies, but actions that will ensure this company operates with integrity." He turned to the screen behind him, where the new employee policies were listed. 1. Wage increases for all delivery drivers. 2. The elimination of unfair payroll deductions. 3. A new oversight committee to prevent abuse of power. 4. A secure, anonymous reporting system for employees. Ethan scanned the room. The skepticism was still there. Years of corruption didn't just disappear overnight, but for the first time, he saw something else too. Hope. The people who helped win the war. Sophie Lang, now Vice President of Human Resources, stood beside Ethan, reviewing paperwork for the company's new internal ethics committee. After years of watching people like Richard Holloway manipulate the system, she was finally in a position to stop it from happening again. Lucas Meyer had upgraded the company's IT security infrastructure, ensuring that no executive could ever alter payroll records or erase incriminating emails the way Michael Green had. Owen Parker was leading a new quality control division, implementing an anonymous employee feedback system, a way for workers to report abuse without fear of retaliation. And Miguel Rojas? Miguel had gone from a delivery driver to an employee representative on the board. A direct voice for the people who had been ignored for so long. When Ethan had offered him the position, Miguel had hesitated. "I don't know anything about corporate politics," he had admitted. Ethan had simply smiled. "Good. That means you won't play their games." The cost of winning. Victory had not come without consequences. While Richard Holloway and Derek Thompson were gone, their absence had left a vacuum, one that some in the company still wanted to fill. Ethan had lost allies in the boardroom. Some executives had quietly resigned, unwilling to work under a leadership that valued ethics over profits. Others stayed, but their loyalty was uncertain. The company's public reputation had taken a hit. Customers had been outraged by the scandal. And though sales had started to recover, trust was something that would take time to rebuild. And then there was the unanswered question. Had they really destroyed the system? Or had they only cut off one head of a larger beast? The warning that changed everything. It was late when Ethan returned to his office. The building was quiet, the halls empty except for the janitorial staff finishing up for the night. A thick envelope sat on his desk. There was no return address. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in the same precise font as the last note he had received. "I was never alone. You cut off a limb. But the machine keeps running. Be careful, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan exhaled slowly, setting the paper down. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Richard Holloway may have been taken down, but he hadn't built that system alone. Somewhere, others were still watching, still waiting. Ethan leaned back in his chair. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Ethan sat alone in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the window. Chicago was alive, its streets pulsing with energy. But inside this quiet space, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. The battle against Richard Holloway had been won. But at what cost? He had spent months unraveling the corruption that had plagued Prime Slice Pizza. Exposing fraud, taking down a powerful executive, and reshaping the company's foundation. But now that the dust had settled, an unsettling truth remained. He had only scratched the surface. There were still names missing from the puzzle, still shadows moving behind the scenes. The crossroads. Sophie Lang entered the office, setting a fresh report on Ethan's desk. Finalized updates on the new policies. She said, "Everything is in place. Employees are already seeing the changes." Ethan nodded, flipping through the pages. Salary adjustments, fairer working conditions, whistleblower protections. It was everything he had fought for. "You did it, Ethan," Sophie continued. "You changed the company." But he wasn't sure if that was enough. He exhaled. "I should feel relieved, shouldn't I?" Sophie studied him for a moment before responding. "Maybe, but you don't." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Because I know this isn't over." The look in her eyes told him she understood. A new threat emerges. Before Ethan could say anything else, his phone buzzed. Lucas Meyer's name flashed across the screen. Ethan answered. "What is it?" Lucas didn't waste time. "I found something." A pause. Then, "And you're not gonna like it." 20 minutes later, Ethan stood in the IT department as Lucas pulled up a financial report on his screen. "I was doing a final sweep through old records," Lucas explained, making sure there weren't any leftover vulnerabilities. "And then I found this." He zoomed in on a section of the report. Transactions buried deep within the corporate financial archives. At first glance, they looked routine, but then Ethan saw it. A series of anonymous wire transfers, millions of dollars moving through offshore accounts. And at the end of the chain, a name appeared. Apex Global Holdings. Ethan's pulse quickened. Who the hell is Apex Global Holdings? Lucas turned to face him. They're one of the largest multinational food corporations in the world. They don't just own restaurants, they own entire supply chains, distribution networks, processing plants, even some regulatory agencies in other countries. Ethan frowned. And they were funneling money into Prime Slice? Lucas nodded. I checked. The financial connections go back years. Richard Holloway wasn't just committing fraud to line his own pockets. He was working for someone bigger. A sick feeling settled in Ethan's gut. Michael Green had been a pawn. Richard Holloway had been a lieutenant. But the real kingpin? Lucas exhaled. Ethan, I think we just found the people who are actually running the system. The choice. For a long time, Ethan didn't speak. His mind raced through the implications. Taking down Richard had been a war, one that had nearly cost him everything. Taking on Apex Global Holdings? That wasn't just a battle. That was a war against an empire. If he walked away now, he could focus on stabilizing Prime Slice Pizza and protecting the progress he had made. But if he pushed forward, he would be challenging a corporation more powerful than anything he had faced before. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. You changed the company. But had he changed the industry? Had he truly dismantled the machine that had allowed this corruption to thrive in the first place? Or had he only removed a single cog? A new war begins. Ethan turned back to the glowing screen, his jaw tightening. He hadn't started this fight to walk away before it was finished. The world needed to know. And if Apex Global Holdings thought they could operate in the shadows forever, they were about to find out how wrong they were. He straightened his suit, glanced at Lucas, and said, "Find me everything you can." Then, he walked to the window, staring out over the city, the battlefield that awaited him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And just like that, one simple pizza order unraveled a system built on greed and exploitation. But this story isn't just about corruption, it's about the power of doing what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Because sometimes, change starts with one person asking the right questions. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you walk away, or fight for something bigger? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that expose the truth hidden in the shadows, make sure to subscribe to Shadow Secrets, because the next revelation is always closer than you think.